Editorial. For the sake of expediency, I believe it would be prudent to explain myself the rest of the Battle of Ignis. Needless to say, the death of the war chief caused no shortage of confusion and devastation for the infrastructure of the Greenskin forces, if infrastructure is even an appropriate word for their form of hierarchy. However, even the death of a war chief can quell the bloodlust of an entire Orc army, only so little, so the battle raged on for another few hours. The arrival of the Wulin Blue Dragon Corps was instrumental in breaking the Orc assault. It goes without saying that had Qinglong not arrived with his army, the battle would likely have not ended in a victory. The Blue Dragons decimated the east flank of the Orc army, and with the relief that came with that, the noble legion was able to rally and launch a series of artillery salvos that fractured the green tide. From there, the fury of Valkenheim and the Mire worked to break apart any stragglers and solitary soldiers that were leaving. In the end, the Orcs were routed and forced to retreat. Now, any members of the Ordo Xenos with any experience with greenskins will be more than aware that a mere rout isn't enough to contend with an Orc infestation. But rest assured that I was already making arrangements to clean up the matter. The Inquisition is nothing if not resourceful. Requisitioning the Astra Militarum to dispatch a nearby regiment of guard units, specifically the Ossian 1st, to help clean up the remaining Orc warbands was a simple matter. I, for one, had more than enough of the beast, and I figured Heathmore had as well. And it was a good thing, because Heathmore was about to have far bigger problems to deal with besides greenskins. While the guard cleaned up the mess of my predecessor, I decided to do some investigating work of my own. Why had the Blue Dragons delayed in coming to the aid in battle? According to Qinglong, they had detoured to investigate a disturbance in a coastal town on the eastern edges of Valkenheim. But why? What had been found? Well, I wanted to know, so I visited the town myself. And there were signs of something sinister, but I couldn't confirm my suspicions right away, as Qinglong had seen fit to burn most of the town to the ground. But that would all change when I went once more to meet with the Alliance of Warriors that I'd met months ago in the Blue Citadel. After their victory, the clans of Valkenheim had returned to their homeland to lick their wounds and see to their people. The daimyo who had joined forces with Amaku were still remaining to treat their injured. The legions that had elected to aid the Noble Legion were beginning to disperse, but the leaders of the original 4 contenders to this alliance remained. Daimyo Nakano Tomoe, Jarl Aella of Raffenfeld, Knight Warden William of Akshire, and now the Blue Dragon Qinglong. When William had returned from defeating the war chief, he had been taken immediately to a makeshift infirmary where he could receive first aid. He proceeded to fall into unconsciousness for 2 days and did not leave the apothecary for another day. We will pick up our log with a recording from Qinglong, who, upon waiting for William to join them, was now having a meeting with Aella, Tomoe, and William himself. From the Logs of the Blue Dragons, Conquering the Green. It was with a heavy heart that I looked upon the beaten, worn down, and exhausted alliance before me. Tomoe and Aella in particular looked weakened. They were out of their armor and wore more casual attire, most likely because their armor needed repairing. William couldn't even put on his tunic. His chest was bandaged tightly, and he sat shirtless against the back of the tent. His eyes fixed on me with a look of consideration and frustration. I could understand his feelings. He was angry at me for having waited so long to come to their aid. He'd been sure to shout at me quite extensively when I checked in on him at the infirmary. I did not waste time arguing with him. I had my reasons. Reasons that I would be more than glad to reveal before all of them. The other 2 were not too happy with my tardiness either, but all were expectant and patient with me as I prepared to speak. But how would I explain the nature of our discovery? I was still not quite sure. Behind me stood the ever-timid Chu Ying, feeling very uncomfortable around the formidable warriors in the tent.
You wanted an audience with all of us, Blue Dragon?
Aella muttered.
Well, here we are. Now what is it you want?
I looked at her and then sighed. I understand your frustration with our tardiness, I began, but the sneer from all 3 of them told me I'd best not dwindle on that matter too much. A mere apology would not sate their anger, but perhaps my evidence would help them understand. I stepped forward, drawing my shoulders back to look imposing. Before coming, my army stopped by a village to the east coast of Valkenheim. The town was small, home to only about 30 or 40 individuals. You know, I do hope you're coming around to some kind of point, William snarled. It was unlike William to be this short-tempered. In William's defense, he was still recovering from his injuries and was likely in pain. I imagine he was a bit irritable. No sooner did we get near the town than we were attacked. We fended off the aggressors, but what we found in the town was unnerving, I explained, feeling Zhu Ying shrinking back in fear, muttering under her breath about something awful. I knew what she was remembering. I put my hand on her shoulder. There was something there.
Well, what was it?
Ayala asked. I'd like to know that too. We all turned to see a surprising figure enter the tent. He looked just as he had when last we saw him at the Blue Citadel. The strange coat, the exotic weapon at his side, the small smile on his face. Joseph Corvan, the mysterious mystic who called himself Inquisitor. Oh yes, I did indeed want a place at this table. I had my suspicions, of course, about what was going on, but wanted to verify, so I invited myself to the meeting. I know it's not the most polite thing to do, but Inquisitors aren't famous for their attention to etiquette, particularly when the fate of the Segmentum is at stake.
How on earth did you find us?
Tomoe asked, surprised. Oh, come now, he laughed. Finding the location of a massive battle like this? I hardly need to be an Inquisitor to find that out. Besides, I've been investigating your lands for some time, and I want to know what it is your friend discovered. You happened to burn the whole place to the ground. He looked to me with a glance that told me he wouldn't wait long for my accommodation, and all the others in the room stared at me as well, surprised I had gone to such lengths to burn the village. It was necessary, and I hoped that my evidence would explain that. I gulped, feeling somewhat uneasy by this strange man, who seemed to look through me as easily as if he were looking through glass. I then sighed and turned to Zhu Ying. Bring the body. Zhu Ying stepped out of the tent, and we fell into silence, everyone waiting for me to speak. We entered the town expecting to find civilians and innocents. Instead, we found horrors. There was no one there, no innocent women and children, no elderly men attempting to hide or beg for mercy. There was... I paused, all eyes on me, and after a few moments Zhu Ying returned. Beside her was a Tian Di, who was helping her drag a large burlap sack behind them. At its approach, everyone took a slight step back, as if the presence of the object made them uneasy. We stared at it. All of us. No one wanting to remove the bag and reveal what was inside. But finally, the Inquisitor walked forward. May I? He asked. I nodded. With a single move of his hand, he ripped back the flap of the bag and yanked the baggage off the corpse. It lay there. Horrific. Human, or at least what appeared to be human. It was male. Its body was tattooed with strange and unworldly symbols. Its face twisted in an expression of sadistic, euphoric ecstasy, as if, in its dying moments, it had been filled with unbelievable pleasure and pain all at once. Its eyes were bugging, locked open and staring off into space. A circle was emblazoned on its forehead, with 8 arrows jolting out of its sides in all directions. The Inquisitor only stared at it, his smile gone and his face locked in. What I could only describe as disbelief. William's eyes were wide with shock. Ayala had stepped back so far her hair was hitting the tent wall. Tomoe was muttering something in Japanese that I couldn't understand.
By the Allfather, what is that thing?
Ayala hissed. It was a man, Joseph answered dispassionately as he investigated the entire body. Don't look too closely at the symbols on his form. They can make you go mad if you're not careful. Now all of our eyes turned from the body to him. He seemed familiar with the sight. You know what this is? Yes, I'm afraid I do, Joseph answered, looking up at me with a serious expression. It was jarring. When he'd first showed himself to us discussing the Orks, he'd been relaxed, even whimsical about the Ork invasion. But now he seemed nervous, even frightened by this body. Well, frightened may not be the most accurate term, but I was certainly not happy about it. Well, what can you tell us? William asked. Little, I fear, he answered. But there's more I need to know. Did you discover anything else besides this body? I nodded my reply. This wasn't the only body we discovered. There were others. And an altar. Zhu Ying went stiff, tears running down her face. There were bodies like this one impaled, twisted in odd and frightening ways that looked unnatural. There were mutilated corpses nailed to walls, and they were left with various horrific symbols and bloody artistic text left on them that drove some of my men to panic attacks and fits. Zhu Ying here actually broke down screaming. She was in hysterics. Was she now? Joseph replied, eyeing her with a degree of interest before turning back to me. Anything else? Did you see armored giants or unnatural-looking beasts? Now all of us were staring at him with a look of horror. No, I answered. We saw nothing like that. Although, some of the corpses near the center of the altar looked partially eaten, and some of them appeared deformed. Claws, fangs, one had horns.
I think one had a bird beak.
Zhu Ying whimpered. Joseph stared at us, and then at the body, and after a moment he stood up straight. Very well, he sighed. It seems that your world is in far more danger than I thought. These markings and the ceremonial altar you describe point to this being a chaos cult. I was pleased to see that I wasn't the only one confused by this information. Joseph looked to us all and closed his eyes in frustration. I'm afraid it would be most upsetting for my colleagues to learn that I tell you anything about this, but for your own survival, I'll make an exception. To any of my readers in the Ordo Malleus who take issue with my divulging what I have to the people of Heathmore, know that you are free to speak to me about it if you wish, but also know that I do not regret my actions in the slightest. When it was fully revealed to me what was coming to that poor world, I'd go so far as to say that it was for the good of the Imperium at large that I say something. What he told us was difficult to hear, and even harder to imagine. I transcribe here all he said, but even as the words are written, I find myself struggling to believe them. There is a power that exists beyond the scope of your vision, a power we know as Chaos, or the Great Enemy. Chaos is governed by 4 different rulers, or gods, if you will, who behave and think differently, but all seek a similar thing, the full domination of the galaxy here and beyond. The markings you see on this man, as well as the ceremonial altar you stumbled upon, are all signs and indications of chaos worship and cult activity. This man was a cultist who was sacrificed in honor to his patron deities, as were likely most of the townsfolk.
That's outlandish. How can what you say be true? It's just not possible.
Tomoe cried. Your reaction's not uncommon, Miss Nakano. Most struggle to believe in the full reach and threat of the ruinous powers. However, the horrified sensation you felt when you looked at this corpse, the terror that struck you at the altar, Qinglong, the bloody sacrifices and symbols, these are all emblematic of a chaos cult. I have no doubt about it. You said there were 4 governing gods of this chaos, William pointed out. To whom did this man worship? And which one of them are we combating?
And how do we slay him?
Ayala demanded.
God or no, I will not have Valkenheim entertain the presence of this foreign god.
He laughed at our questions, though it was a laugh without warmth. Of course I was bloody laughing. Any who act at all familiar with the nature of chaos know that the idea of killing a chaos god is a fanciful notion at best. However, William's question was a decent one, though not for the reasons he thought. William surely believed that if they knew which chaos god was behind the cult, they could somehow defeat the god and thereby defeat the cult. A practical but inefficient conclusion. I'm afraid it's not so simple. This symbol on the man's forehead, you see? He pointed to the circle with the 8 arrows. This is a symbol of chaos undivided. These men are working with not one chaos deity, but are working on behalf of all 4 of them, likely under the leadership of, well, some unifying leader. From there, the room turned to utter confusion, each of us trying to speak over the other and get an understanding. William was forgetting his own injuries, sitting up fast and then wincing as he sat back down. Ayala noticed and knelt beside him, but never taking her eyes off of Joseph. Tomoe was pacing, ranting on about if she'd known the severity of the situation. And as for me, I just wanted to know what to do next, what the next step was. Joseph seemed to be both listening and dismissing us without saying a word, looking at the body and then at the ground as if deep in thought. Enough, he finally shouted, somehow bringing silence to the room. This is getting us nowhere.
But what do we do about this?
Ayala demanded.
How deep has this infestation spread? What does this cult aim to do?
All good questions, but I'm afraid I have no answers as of yet, Joseph explained. In the meantime, I suggest we begin searching for signs of further chaos work. What are suspicious things we should be aware of? I asked. Keep your eyes out for men and women who dress or behave strangely, who begin acting violently for no apparent reason. Look into any social groups or organizations that meet at odd times, or who you may have overlooked. Check people for tattoos that do match ones you know. Are there any organizations that currently exist that you know of that behave in malicious ways such as this? Well, Horkos is vile, William grunted, but they've been around for some time, and I doubt that would be one of the cults. They seem to just worship Astria.
The Jormungandr, perhaps?
Tomoe asked.
They've been known to behave savagely.
And what about the Hitakiri?
Aola hissed back.
Don't pretend you're without your share of rotten fruit.
I said enough, Joseph finally barked. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. He grabbed the sack he'd ripped off the Chaos body and tossed it over it again. Chaos excels at doing one thing, dividing and undermining. Their very presence has already turned you against one another within moments. You're playing right into their hands and you didn't even realize it. The four of us looked between each other, a feeling of shame washing over myself at least. I suspect William as well. Joseph had then looked to the body he covered and turned his face away from it. I recommend you gather your armies and return to your homes for the time being. Begin investigating your domains for signs of the heretics.
And what about you?
Tomoe asked. I have my own investigation to undergo, but I will require assistance. He turned towards me and smiled, though there was some degree of urgency in it. Your friend here, what's her name? I looked to Su Ying, who now had wide eyes, surprised that she was being addressed. Su Ying. She is my assistant. I'd like to borrow her, Joseph said calmly. Why? I demanded protectively. Joseph sighed patiently. You said she broke down into hysterics when she got close to the Chaos Altar? It seems to me she has an acute awareness of chaos power. Perhaps she can aid me in my search then. I started to object, but then stopped myself. It was true. For as long as I'd known her, Su Ying had always been able to sense things. Small details the rest of us never really quite noticed. If Joseph knew secrets about this cult nonsense, then Su Ying could help. Su Ying, you're to go with the Inquisitor.
Are you sure it's safe? What if something happens?
I can assure you, she will be totally under my protection, Joseph said warmly, bowing politely. See that she is, I insisted, not trusting his bow at all. I can't say I blame him for not trusting it, but I was being honest. I would do everything in my power to protect Su Ying from harm, but it's always wise to stay wary of Inquisitors. Frankly, we hardly trust ourselves. Excellent, Joseph replied as Su Ying cautiously approached him. My friends, I can't stress to you the seriousness of the situation. We must be diligent and wary at this point in time. Be cautious of anything suspicious. What of the Orks? They weren't all wiped out, William pointed out. I'm taking care of that as we speak. Oh, commendable job, by the way, in dealing with them. It's no small feat to withstand a full Ork battle group. This seemed to lift the spirits of the room, but not mine. I still didn't like this. I got the distinct impression that Joseph wasn't telling us everything, but I knew better than to ask. He's right, of course, and it was wise of him not to ponder too heavily. I didn't want to have to lie to him, or to kill him. With all that out of the way, I must go and begin making arrangements. I'll contact you when I learn more of the situation. Joseph turned to leave.
One more question.
Tomoe called.
You asked about giants and monsters. Are there really such things among the chaos cults?
Joseph paused without looking back. Only in the worst-case scenario, he muttered. If you do spot one or more of these armored giants, your world may well be beyond hope. He left without another word, leaving us all stupefied with horror. I was, of course, referring to the traitor Astartes. Of course, I didn't want to exterminate the planet. After all, none of the heretical Astartes had been seen yet, and for all I knew, this cult was still just a fledgling one, an early stage of heresy, not uncommon on any world. But I still had a bad feeling about the situation. I made an immediate call to a contact of mine in the Ordo Malleus and informed him of the situation I found myself in. He was of like mind with me. The cult needed to be dealt with immediately, fledgling or no, although he advised me to begin considering drastic measures if necessary. It was, after all, a primitive world, not high on the priority list. I personally wasn't entirely sure it needed to go that far at the time, but I confess, as my investigation proceeded and I learned the truth, the actual origin of this corruption, I suppose I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let's just say I had yet to even grasp what was happening below the surface of Heathmore, and worse, what was yet to come.